Thank you to you and the Innovators community and to everyone who is here on this call. So our plan, as Hans described, is we'll have a fireside chat. We'll use a cooking analogy, a little bit more on that in a moment, but on how to create innovation chefs. Thank you for the introduction, Hans. I'll just add a little bit more here. So Natalie Painchaud with InnoSight, and we are a innovation and strategy growth consulting firm. We were co-founded by the late Clayton Christensen, who wrote many of the books on disruptive innovation. And as Hans mentioned, also co-author of Eat, Sleep, Innovate. And I'm joined by Steve and Sharon Bussey, who are profiled in the book with stories of innovation from the Salvation Army. And we want to make this as interactive as possible. So of course, please use the chat. We have Q&A at the end. And then on our next slide here, we'd also like to just start with a poll. So if you could go to slido.com, or the other option is just use the camera function on your phone and the barcode here, and you'll be taken to our first poll question, which is, what one word describes your organization's culture? We've got 4 responses here, so which I think you can all see. So others focus, scattered, non-focus, speed, innovative. So it sounds like we might have some cultures of innovation already, which is great to hear. And others that are struggling. So opportunities for improvement, and hopefully we can help you today. And caring is a wonderful description for an organization. Lack of clarity. Okay, thank you all so much for sharing. Great to see our starting point. Sharon, I'll hand it back over to you. Reactive, okay.
Get back on there.
And Sharon's going to kick us off with a story.
Right. Well, it's very exciting to be here. Thanks so much for having us. First of all, I'm just making sure that you are able to see the correct screen. Is all good? All right. Awesome. Well, you just shared a word that describes the culture in your organization. I think a lot of organizations today think that they've discovered the secret sauce to innovation, that secret recipe. And that reminds me of a secret recipe that we have in my family. I'm originally from South Africa, and we have this recipe that's been passed down for 6 generations. It started with my great-great-grandmother, who was actually blind. And she made this recipe using her sense of touch. And so when it came to ingredients, she would weigh them with her hand. And just by feeling the ingredients, she knew what to add and at what point the mixture was ready to be poured into the pie crust. And you can see a picture of that delicious, what we call milk tart right there on the screen. Her name was Ma Brophy. And Ma was the talk of the town because she had this secret recipe and everybody wanted to know what was in that recipe. But Ma wouldn't tell anybody because she wanted to pass it down in the family. And so she actually passed it down to my grandmother, who also learned how to make this milk tart, this recipe, using her sense of touch. And so together they would weigh the ingredients until my grandmother knew just exactly how to get this recipe right. Well, eventually my grandmother passed that recipe on to my mother. And my mother said, I'm not going to be able to figure out how to weigh these ingredients with my hands. So she got her measuring cups and jugs out. And whenever my grandmother would weigh an ingredient with her hand, my mother would measure it and she wrote it down on a little recipe card. I received that recipe card so that I could then make the milk tart for my family. And then I moved from South Africa to the United States. And if any of you have lived internationally, you know that food is just not the same. And so I couldn't find all the same ingredients. I had to tweak and adjust that recipe just a little bit. And then, of course, my daughters grew up and they're now 23 and 22. And I thought, how am I going to make sure they learn how to make this milk tart? I have to understand the medium in which they live. And so I turned that recipe card with all of those slight adjustments into a video that they can now play. And they've learned how to make the recipe by watching the video and making it alongside me. You know, I had to take that tacit knowledge that my great-great-grandmother had, and eventually as it passed down, I had to begin to make it more explicit so that my daughters would have something physical that they could use to replicate that recipe. We had this great culture of cooks, right? But we needed to take a tacit knowledge and make it explicit. I wonder if that's true in some of our organizations today. Sometimes we have that secret recipe for innovation, but is the recipe so secret that it could be lost from one generation to another? How are we making that knowledge very explicit so that it can be passed down and we can continue to cultivate that culture of innovation and be very intentional about passing that knowledge on? So that's a little bit of what we're going to be exploring today as we look at creating innovation chefs together.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. And so some organizations, as Sharon said, have this culture of innovation that exists, but they might not have the words to describe it. And on other organizations, they're looking to create one. So the origin story for this book traces back to a meeting about 5 years ago with my colleague, Scott Anthony, the co-author on the book. And he was with a logistics firm, CEO of a logistics firm in Asia. And we were doing the typical work that we do, set the innovation strategy, build the innovation capabilities, put in place a process. And the CEO said, I get all this. We're doing all this. What about the other 25,000 people in my organization? How do I make sure they're innovating? We said, great question. We actually don't have the answer. And went out and did some research, which is what we love to do. And then a few years later, we had the opportunity to cross paths with Paul Cobbin, a co-author in the book, who is also the Chief Transformation Officer at DBS. And he asked us the same question: can we purposely, intentionally create a culture of innovation? We embarked on some work with DBS with their Tech Operations Center in Hyderabad, and I'm pleased to report that the answer is yes. If we go to the next slide, I'd like to just share with you kind of the book in a minute. And, innovation is something different that creates value. While most organizations are set up to perpetuate today, to do today's work better, to be more efficient, not to do something different. And I think the folks that we are just so fortunate to have endorsements from, leaders in innovation and creativity, sum up how to do this quite well. I'd like to start with Ed Catmull, co-founder of Pixar, author of Creativity Inc., probably the best book on creativity. And what he shares is create a culture that emboldens people to act like innovators. Underlying this is a foundational assumption that people are capable of doing this. In fact, it's a skill that comes naturally to us all as children. The next is, if you're creating a culture that allows people to do the things that come naturally, well, let's understand what's getting in the way. We call it institutionalized inertia, what holds us back. And Rita McGrath from the from Columbia Business School, talks about surfacing and breaking down those day-to-day behaviors, or what we call those hidden blockers. You can't address something if you don't know what it is. So next up, so this here is the CEO of DBS Bank, Piyush Gupta, who, as we talk about DBS's journey to really create a 28,000 person startup, to operate like a startup, to transform and move from stodgy bank to digital company, they have proven that you can intentionally orchestrate a program to design your culture. And then lastly here, the idea is, once you've gotten clear about those behaviors, broken down the barriers, had this intentional effort, the key is to make new habits, as Amy Edmondson describes here. And so what we've seen is most organizations go out and they study the FANGs. Well, what does that mean? So they look at companies like Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, the companies that come to mind when you think of innovation. But if you go out and try to replicate what they've done, it's not clear exactly what you can copy, what is just inherent in their origin story. And so we took a step back and we said, can we look at to understand what innovation is and where this happens at lots of different organizations. And as I mentioned, we're very intentional and we always start with definitions. So the definition of innovation, it's doing something different that creates value. And the something is important here. Oftentimes we set innovation out to be this inaccessible, big thing that's like just intimidating. But the something here is it could be a process improvement. It could be, an incremental change. But the key is it's something different and it's creating value. And that this is really something that anybody in an organization can do. And so given this definition of looking at innovation, we said, let's go out and find some no debts. You'll see we really like acronyms. But a no debt is a normal organization doing extraordinary things. And this is what brought us to the Salvation Army. Steve, could you share how we connected?
Sure. So what's so fascinating, we had a serendipitous moment where Scott and Natalie and their team at Insight were really looking for these no debts. And at the same time, we were sort of on the opposite end where we have this, as Sharon was sharing her story, this tacit sort of knowledge within the Salvation Army. And we were asking ourselves, are there ways that we might be able to take that tacit knowledge and make it more explicit? Like she was saying, write these things from the hand field to the recipe card process. And so that led us to studying different sort of innovation theories and things. That led us to the writings of Scott Anthony and Insight. And it led to Scott and I connecting on LinkedIn, which resulted in him inviting Sharon and I to be part of their innovation lab through Harvard Business Review to begin to discuss from many different points of view. We came from a nonprofit perspective, which was a completely different background to your FANG organizations. But we were looking to the FANG organizations for some inspiration to bring into the nonprofit and the church community, and they were looking. So this serendipity led us to this moment. That led to Natalie and one of her team members named Annie Garofalo coming to the Salvation Army and meeting with our executive leadership, and then along with that, exploring the culture of innovation in the Salvation Army. Now, we say that the Salvation Army is in many ways like an octopus with many tentacles, that we are driven by who we are and why we exist. We are driven by our mission. And as a result of that, have many different avenues of service in which we're able to express that. That's in many ways where the culture of innovation comes. I use the illustration of a soft, runny egg to describe the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army is a church. And so in many ways, that is the starting point of what drives us, that love, loving God, loving our neighbor as ourselves, that drives us to find, as a nonprofit service-based organization, to innovate at the point of human need. And then like the shell, so that's like the egg white, the temporal sort of service that we provide. The shell is really the corporate infrastructure that allows us to be able to do that on scale. And so part of what the mission of the Salvation Army, again, from that is to find ways to be able to share that good news. And then along with that, to be able to meet human needs in his name without discrimination. So the Salvation Army, it's not just about thinking about doing good. It's really pragmatic. It's really practically driven to try to do the most good for those who are in the greatest need. The Salvation Army is about innovating at the point of human need. And wherever the people are, the love of those people, the empathy of that, identifying their problems and finding a way to meet those solutions with limited resources is really what drives this organization. Now, what's so interesting is in 1998, Peter Drucker, who is the guru of management, who many look to, Insight's material is littered with Peter Drucker's theories as well that's helped to shape them. He said this. He said, and this caught us totally off guard. The Salvation Army is by far the most effective organization in the U.S. No one comes close to it in respect to clarity of mission, the ability to innovate, measurable results, dedication, and putting money to maximum use. Well, when we read this, we thought, what is he talking about? Because we didn't think of ourselves as innovative. But in fact, this sort of led this curiosity to sort of understand, what does Peter Drucker mean? And what are we doing that is capturing his attention? And is there something here in this normal organization that is just really focused on innovating at the point of need that could actually speak to the broader innovation community? And so We came up in that idea lab, which we had with Scott, Natalie, and the gang. We came up with this analogy, which stuck with the case study. And we said, when you go to a Michelin star restaurant and you say go to a French restaurant where you have an award-winning chef with that big white hat living in that pristine, metallic kitchen with an army of soldiers that are cooking your molecular gastronomic piece of art, that could sit in the finest art galleries. You sit there and you eat that and you go, wow, that's an incredible meal. That's an award-winning. That tastes delicious, because they understand the science of cooking, the art, the craft of cooking, and all of those processes, they've meticulously, they're PhDs in cooking. And that is a great plate of food. That's your FANG organizations who do that. But on the other hand, it seems like the world of the culinary sort of innovation world has begun to look at another source. There are these grandmothers, like Sharon's grandmother, who live in the hills of Italy, who forage around their community to find things that are around there. And they do what their mother and their grandmother and their great-grandmother did, because it's just implicit. It's just a natural, organic part of the environment, of the soil, of the culture in which they're living. And as a result of that, she produces a plate of food that could not only stand up to, but might possibly even beat that Michelin star's plate of food. See, there are many different ways that we can cook a meal. And just like that, in the world of innovation, I think we might limit ourselves if we only look to the Michelin star chefs. The world of innovation, we believe that creativity exists in every single person. And so there might be new avenues, new opportunities, new spaces in which we can explore innovation and understand how we can do something different that is going to produce value. That can not just speak to our world, but speak to many different industries.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And so a culture of innovation is one in which the behaviors, key word here is behaviors, that drive innovation success come naturally. Well, in order to know, to live into that, you have to understand what are those behaviors? What is that Italian grandmother doing, right? And so we've distilled 5 innovation behaviors from our research and from our field work. And I'd like to share those with you. So we start with curiosity. And in the book, we go into a lot of detail and provide examples of what are behaviors that live into this curiosity bucket. For example, do we see people in the organization who are questioning the status quo and who are searching for better and different solutions? The next behavior is customer obsession, this relentless search for deeper understanding of what are customers trying to get done? What are their jobs to be done? Maybe it's customers, maybe it's different stakeholders, but really tapping into your empathy and walking in that other person's shoes. The third behavior is collaboration. Collaboration happens at the intersections of ideas, of people, of analogies, of business models. And, so in the organization, are we seeing cross-functional expertise being shared? The fourth behavior, a little bit of a mouthful, is adept in ambiguity. Essentially, is there a culture of experimentation? Do we see people coming up with hypotheses and then running experiments to either prove or disprove them and adjust accordingly? And the last one, quite possibly is my favorite, is empowered, which is to do something different, you have to do something. So do we see initiative? Do we see people who are finding the resources they need to make confident decisions? So 5 behaviors: curious, customer obsessed, collaborative, adept in ambiguity, and empowered. We'll go to the next slide. So great, now we know what are those behaviors. How do we actually encourage people in the organization to do this? And we borrow from the field of behavioral science. We didn't invent this. We just went out and we said, let's study and learn from the best. Organizations like Weight Watchers or Alcoholics Anonymous. To understand how do you encourage a new behavior. And we use a fun analogy here. We call it a bean. So let me describe the 3 parts of a bean. The first is the behavior enabler. That is the direct way to change a behavior. It might look like a process or a checklist, for example. The last piece is the nudge, and that's where the behavioral science piece comes in. That's where you don't even really notice it's happening. This could be something like gamification. And sitting in the middle of those two is the artifact, and that is the digital or physical reminder. And you'll see throughout the book and here, we've actually animated them. Our co-author, Paul, is a banker by day and a doodler by night. So he did all of these fun drawings that you see throughout the book and in our presentation here. I'd like to bring these to life with by just sharing with you what a beanstorm is. So this is the process by which we go out and we work with organizations, or we encourage you to do this on your own, is to run this three-step process. And you see over here on our right, our bean is smashing the status quo. So how do you break through those behavioral blockers? Step number one, finish the sentence of "we strive to." What is that behavior? It might look like those 5 behaviors that we've provided to you, and you can use those as inspiration, or it might look a little bit different in your organization. But the key here is to get very granular and specific about those behaviors. The second is to identify the behavioral blockers and go beyond the obvious surface level runs of "we don't have resources, time, I'm worried about failure," and really understand what are people doing instead. Until you can get clear about that blocker, it will be very difficult to overcome it. And then third, put in place the bean. What is the thing that you should start doing? And we have lots of beans to inspire you. I'll share just 3 before Steve shares a story at the Salvation Army, just to give you a little teaser or appetizer, if you will. Great. So our first one here, and we provide 101 of these in the book and on our companion website. This is the Optus customer close-up. So Optus does immersions where team members go out and just immerse and spend the day with customers and their customer relations team. The second one we have here is innocence, just go with it. So if an individual, an employee has an idea and they're 70% certain they're going to be successful with it, the organization encourages them to just go with it. The third one, I love this animation. This is Boehringer Ingelheim, the pharmaceutical company, has something they call lunch roulette. So to encourage collaboration, they have a website. If you don't have a lunch buddy that day, you can sign up and just be paired up with someone. And I'd say this is probably even easier in the Zoom world that we're living in because it makes logistics a little bit simpler. So keep these 3 beans in mind as Steve shares a story from the Salvation Army.
And just before I start the story, I just want to give a shout out to Captain Mike Harper, who's here with us today. He's actually on the Zoom call, and I'm going to embarrass him by telling a little bit of his story, but his story is actually one of the case stories which was in the book as well. And Mike, as a Salvation Army officer, is somebody who loves people. I know him, his wife, as well. They really exemplify that in so many amazing ways. And they were in New Hampshire serving. And when they were there, again, the Salvation Army, when we have emergency disasters, we have these large canteens that will go into a neighborhood and you can serve coffee from them. People will come to you and you'll get that vehicle close. But you can't really sort of take that vehicle to, sort of more intimate places. And so as he got to his community, several of those who were homeless, who were living in the cold of New England as wintertime came up, really needed a hot, warm cup of coffee. But again, not being able to get to the Salvation Army canteens, there was this challenge, this problem, this job that needed to be done of how do we innovate at the point of human need? How do we take the solution to where the people are at and to be able to provide that? And so in the process, Mike and his team, Dan, was part of his team there, they discovered there was this old picture from Salvation Army history in the 1940s of this fellow who, in the midst of a fire, the Salvation Army had this tin can, sort of mobile coffee urn that they were able to take and to serve with firefighters. Well, this artifact from the past sort of gave Mike and his team a nudge to sort of say, man, is there a way that we could maybe look differently about how we could service, to innovate at the point of this particular need? And so in searching out to alternative places, there are people today who have mobile canteens that they use these in sports stadiums and other locations. And so taking that from an industry that wasn't a nonprofit industry, he was able to make a connection from the past to an adjacent possibility in the present that he was exploring, and fuse those together, being motivated by that love to service that person who he was seeking to serve, and to develop a way in which he was able to help to get that job needing to be done. And so we have a picture of Dan, who was part of his team, taking one of those things, and they created an initiative called Mobile Joes. Joe is a northeastern sort of way. Joe is an analogy for the word coffee. And so they were able to take coffee to those people, and they were able to innovate at the point of human need.
Great. We have another poll here. We'd like to hear from you. Which beans that I shared the customer close-up, the just go with it, and the lunch roulette, did you hear in the story Steve just shared? And go ahead.
You want to take your phones and pull it out?
Yeah, definitely the just go with it, the empowered behavior. Mike and Dan were living into that. And then the customer close-ups are really connecting and understanding the customers. We even have some votes for lunch roulette, but great. Thanks, everyone. Sharon, I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah.
Do you need me to stop sharing?
And so as Sharon's sharing that, what I'll do is I'll come back and to the story that we've seen. And so if we were to go and trace the story and take it a little bit further, we know that there was this image from the past that led to an exploration of alternative adjacent possibilities in the present. That led to them innovating and really sort of adapting that to a new possibility, a new way to serve at the point of human need. And then once Mike finished that, I think Sharon's going to put this up in just a second. What we see is after they had done this for a while, the story caught on, the Mobile Joe story. And so what happened is Mike and Dan the next year went to a large event, which we have in Old Orchard Beach, where there are hundreds and hundreds of other Salvation Army leaders who were there. And they told their story. At that point, they took the artifact which they're doing, showing it to them to inspire others to aspire to maybe take that idea and replicate it and scale it up into other locations. But along with that, in many ways, creating a behavior enabler, a bean that was saying you too can innovate at the point of human need. Now, what's great, and Mike, what was it, a week or two, Mike, that you sent me some other pictures. He's now up in Portland, Maine, where there's another major need, again, with a large homeless community. And Mike is now training a new group of individuals to be able to go out and to serve the folks of Portland, Maine. And so again, Dan is now in Japan and taking, again, those same principles. And so the idea of how this is able to diffuse throughout the organization, again, it might be that there's a different job to be done, but if we are committed to innovating at the point of human need, then that will expand. Now, Mike didn't sort of go and study the 15 principles of innovation and like a robot, was just sort of going through a checklist. This came naturally from his love for people, from his sense of mission. It was coming from aligning to the identity and the purpose and the values of the organization. Those things are rooted in the past. Those things are timeless. They transcend space or time. And if we can, as organizations, align with that, I would argue that even the organization that isn't necessarily perceived as a culture of innovation today, if you trace back in its history, there's been some point in which which that took place. And if we can tether to that and use that to disrupt ourselves from the present, to allow ourselves to have permission to adapt into new future possibilities, then in many ways, each normal organization, your organization, can truly innovate as well. But it requires us, so much of innovation is focused on the future. And what Natalie and Sharon and I are beginning to discover is that you can innovate by looking back to the past and using that as a catalyst to create disruption in the present and to imagine new future possibilities. So this is part of the model that we're beginning to form. And the align and adapt really ties into some of Jim Collins' theory. And then the explore and exploit part is that we want to, again, explore adjacent possibilities and find alternatives. And you can explore many different industries. You can look at the Salvation Army and say what ideas could come from that industry that could speak to mine. But then when you get to that, when you want to scale it, that's where the exploit comes as well. And so if we look at the story of Mike and Dan and Mobile Joe's, we see that, again, aligning to the past, creating an imagined future, looking to an adjacent possibility, and then scaling that, innovating on a large scale as well. So the story rings true.
So one of the things that Steve and I actually discovered about the Salvation Army is that we've been exploring this process of making, creating artifacts that can allow innovation to move from that tacit place to that explicit place since as early as 1920. And possibly even earlier, but this is a little artifact we wanted to share with you today that shows how the Salvation Army was making that innovation explicit in their culture. And this is what we call as the officer idea exchange. So officer is really a pastor in the Salvation Army. So someone like Mike, who's working on the front lines and is seeking to innovate at that point of human need, when those folks would discover a strategy or a technique that was working, they would contribute it to this exchange, which would be published and then distributed throughout the organization. And there was actually a little reward given. And in fact, if you read at the bottom, it says, if you know of someone who's doing something innovative and they're not sharing it with us, we'll give the reward to you if you share it. Because the goal is that we share these ideas and make sure that we all know the innovative strategies that are being employed so we can benefit from this collaboratively. What's great is that we've been able to benefit from this. So we're really collaborating with dead people sometimes in the work that Steve and I do, because we're reading these idea exchanges, and some of them we've actually been able to implement into ministry today. So that's been a very exciting way to look at it. So in a sense, there's probably way more than 101 of these artifacts that have been published in our history, but Natalie and her team at Insight have published 101 beans in the book, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about that and how to access those 101 as those idea starters to help you get going in thinking innovatively and making that explicit in your culture.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. So I hope you've been inspired by these stories today. And that really is our goal, that you feel inspired. And then we give you lots of inspiration and tools so that you can go make them your own. So as Sharon mentioned, we have 101 beans. They're on eatsleepinnovate.com, and they're also on page 219 in the book. We've organized them by each of the 5 innovation behaviors. Sometimes when we work with clients, we print them out into like a deck of cards. But what I encourage you to do, and what I've done, is I just download it to my mobile phone. So if I'm feeling stuck, I can flip through there for some ideas. So please feel free to do that. And Steve's on that too. That's great.
There we go.
We wanted to share with you, we, in this collaboration, realized we were coming up with a bean. So Sharon is going to share our recipe card.
Yeah, so we took some of those concepts that we've presented to you and we've placed them in a little artifact that you can take home. Steve's going to pop a PDF chat, but you can also go to eatsleepinnovate.com and download our little recipe card. And it really starts with the mise en place, the things that you need to be prepared to have in place, right, before you start this recipe. And by the way, this isn't secret. We're going to share it with the world because we want to make sure, right, that we're moving to that place where our innovation is living explicitly so that we can pass it on effectively. So that mise en place really ties in with a model that Steve shared, that align, adapt, explore, and exploit. And we want to make sure that we're always thinking, particularly as a no debt, but even as a for-profit, like why are we doing what we're doing, and making sure that our innovation aligns to that, right? And then we're free to adapt. That history gives us the freedom to try something new, right? And it kind of frees us up to do that. And then our ingredients are really based on those 5 innovation behaviors that Natalie shared, but we kind of alliterated them, so you can see there it's curiosity, customer obsession, collaboration, kind of comfort with uncertainty, and then constraints. And we're going to talk about that because so often in innovation, we think that to have constraints on us is going to limit our innovation, where really it just directs it. It gives us a focus, right, and pushes us forward. And so those directions you can see, interestingly, the curiosity and the customer obsession need to work together, right? We're curious about our customer, the person we're trying to, the need we're trying to meet in a particular person, but we also need to have that curiosity about our history, about where we come from, about why we're doing what we're doing. That's going to create the motivation for us to keep exploring and the excitement, I think, in the process. And then we're going to add a little bit of collaboration to that, and certainly collaborating with those around you with different skill sets. That's so important. But like we mentioned earlier, collaborating with dead people. Don't be afraid to go and read someplace else and explore what someone else has to contribute to your process. And then being comfortable with that uncertainty, being okay as you whip that batter together, right? And then we're going to pour that mixture into our constraints. So imagine your constraints, your limits around what you can do. And particularly as a no debt, sometimes we've got budgetary limits. We've got limits on people. We all have limits on time. But what are those constraints that we can work within? And so imagine pouring that mixture into a well-greased pan. Now, you know what happens if you make something and you don't grease the pan, it gets stuck in there, right? And our innovation can get stuck sometimes within those constraints. We've got to be willing to grease that so it's going to pop right out, but it's going to have those constraints to give it shape and to push it up. That's what makes the cake go high, right? And so we want to place it within those constraints. So all those little pieces are important. And then you'll notice the little note on the side to try your recipe in small batches first. So bake that recipe for 3 or 4 people and see what they think, get their input before you scale that recipe to feed a banquet. And so that's just some great little innovation principles that we hope is going to be a great artifact for you to take home and to encourage you as you go forward and explore how you can take that tacit knowledge and make it more explicit in your organization.
So we want to thank you guys so much just for having a chance to hear a little bit of our story. We want to thank Natalie, Scott, and the team at Innosight as well. And again, back to that serendipity moment, what's so fascinating is that creativity and that innovation is something that really unites us together. And, Clayton Christensen, who, helped to found Innosight, is the father of disruption theory, right? And what's so fascinating is that the founder of the Salvation Army, one of the co-founders, Catherine Booth, she said this: there's no improving the future without disturbing the present. We could say disrupting the present if we're going to tap into Clayton's theory. And the difficulty is to get people to be willing to be disturbed. I think what Eat, Sleep, Innovate really does is it helps us to figure out ways to unstick that difficulty and find ways to help to create some disruption in your organization and to allow people to be a little more empowered through behavior enablers, artifacts, and nudges to really embrace that curiosity, collaboration, to be empowered, to be willing to do something different that will create value, that will have impact. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Natalie, take it away. Close them.
Yeah. So Hans has mentioned if you have questions, please type in the chat, or if you'd like to be unmuted, just share them. We did have one last poll. We were curious. I've hit play on it, so it's the same Slido, ESI, and link. But we're curious which of the behaviors you're going to get started on first. So if you have a chance to go to that. But yeah, we'd love. Oh, I see people answering.
Should we swap the screens or?
Yeah, I can do that. Oh, this is interesting. I'm glad we did this poll. So number one thing is empowered. And it's shifting. Customer obsessed. So customer obsessed, empowered. Yeah, I think that idea of just getting started is really important. Well, thank you all for sharing. Hans will hand it over to you.
Wonderful. And Jacqueline, I don't know if that's a question or a statement, but please feel free to add a bit more to what you've typed. I'm not sure if I understand, but I have actually two questions, and I must say I'm getting hungry. It's almost like 5 p.m. here in Holland, so the analogy makes me a bit hungry. And for Steve and Sharon, I think I heard you say, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you found yourself to be an example, to be listed as example without kind of even knowing it. And so my question to you is, where does this drive come from, right? To continuously want to innovate, and what's the role of leadership? Where does this drive originate from?
I would say that again, part of it is. Again, when you look at like what is a culture is essentially a worldview. A worldview is shaped by beliefs, values, and practices. And so what happens is initially, thinking of like a Roger Martin's theory that's explored initially as a mystery, but it becomes almost algorithmic at some point. And then when it becomes algorithmic, it's almost that it then becomes tacit, where you're not actually training people explicitly in it. It just happens organically. And I would say that the worldview of the Salvation Army is one that is driven by the values of the Salvation Army. Again, to go back to the fact that as a church motivated by the love of God that wants to see transformation in society, that's the driver in every single person that's working in the Salvation Army. And it's not trying to sort of like finger point or be, a stereotype of what that is, but it's actually trying to, there was an illustration that says it's Christianity with its sleeves rolled up. It's about soup and soap as much as it is salvation. And so when you are really firmly embedded into a value system that says innovate at the point of human need, that's key. With the COVID disaster, again, leadership, that corporate structure, to the egg analogy, is a thin shell. The point isn't to have a big sort of top-down piece, but it's just to be the enabler. And what's happened is that when that took place, there was some organization that took place with COVID, but what happened is the responses in 131 countries, it's crazy what's happening with 1.5 million people in the Salvation Army around the world that see problems and say, with scarce resources, how do we find solutions? Because ultimately we empathize and love people. That you can't, that's something that's organic. You can't, do it. And so I believe that every organization does have a value system but it's not defined by, just the product which they produce. It's the, as Clayton's theory sort of says about jobs to be done, it's understanding what's underneath in terms of the people that you're serving. I would say organizations, we have to understand what is the job that organization is trying to get done as well.
Mm-hmm. And I would add, I think the role of leadership to answer that question is to ensure that there are enterprise-wide solutions to make sure that frontline innovation can happen quicker and easier, so that we are kind of systematized on big things where we can leverage, cost-cutting mechanisms and knowledge that is all grouped together on one platform. But where it comes to the human need aspect, there's got to be a freedom to innovate right there on the front lines. So finding where we can, where we can really systematize things and where we can allow freedom to take place. And I think that's a big role that leadership needs to play as they think through those aspects of making sure people can innovate on the front lines.
Maybe building on that. So Natalie, I guess you've been in, let's say, more corporate environments, right, where maybe on the value, whatever poster is innovation, but it's by far not as ingrained as Steve and Sharon were sharing, right, in their organization. So could you share your answer, like what is the role of leadership from a, let's say, perspective of a corporate where innovation is not really ingrained in the values?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think having a very clear why. And so what Paul will share is they get a lot of organizations coming to DBS and saying, what's your secret sauce, right? And, we want to change, we want to transform. And he's like, what's the overall strategy? What's the from to? Where are you going? So as you think about even DBS and taking something like banking, they want to make banking joyful. They want to transform from a stodgy bank to a digital company. So there was a very clear why, and there was just a consistency from leadership and a consistent support and active engagement from them. And I will say, I do a lot of work in healthcare. Those are very values-driven organizations. And I recently did some work in a supply chain. And you would think that it wouldn't be as clear, but that purpose is to supply hope to people. It's to get them the medicines and the medical supplies they need. So I think it is important to surface that and have conversations about it, but certainly see the values in large corporates as well. Yeah.
Betsy, I don't know if you are able to come on mic and ask your question. Otherwise, I'll be happy to read it out loud, but feel free to unmute and chime in.
Yeah, so good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. So my CEO is of the mind that culture, that culture comes first and innovation comes second. He's not so much on board with having an innovation culture that, then kind of gets ingrained throughout the organization. So I guess I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Like, is it a chicken and egg thing? Does the innovation come first and then the culture follows, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then Steve and Sharon would love your perspectives. I think a typical consultant answer, it really is both. You need both. So one is that empowered piece is very important, that people feel that they can get started today and there's something accessible. And at the same time, there does need to be clarity of vision and a clear why coming down from leadership and the CEO. But curious, Steve and Sharon, your perspectives.
Something I want to add to that, agreeing with Natalie, is that every organization goes through a life cycle, and when we're on the downturn of that life cycle, what's happened is that we to Natalie's point, that we cease sort of, and Simon Sinek talks about this as well, that we cease to be defined by our why and we become more defined by our what. Clayton Christensen would say our success becomes our potential, our potential path to ruin. Theory would talk about path dependency, where we become so dependent because we're defined, again, tacitly by what we do, that can actually entrap us from innovating. How do you break free from that? I would actually suggest that the act of rediscovery is key to breaking free. People say culture eats strategy for breakfast, playing with our food metaphor, going to make Hans extra hungry now. How do you break a culture free? You can develop the best strategic plan on earth, and it's not going to change if it's embedded, if the downturn culture has dominated. So what you need to do is to go back and to rediscover the entrepreneurial edge of your organization. And that often is rooted, because no organization would exist if there wasn't some moment of innovation within that. And through the vehicle of storytelling, stories are the means through which culture is shaped. And it's the means by which you take something that is really rigid or stodgy and to find a way to loosen it up. And when you're able to do that and align to that, that becomes a vehicle that allows you to break through that fixed mindset of the present to being able to say, once we understand this is who we are and we're not defined by this algorithmic, thing now I can begin to look in new and fresh ways. but still being aligned to the essence of the idea that gave that source of competitive advantage to the organization.
Exactly. I was thinking about just purely mathematically speaking, when you think about 2 points, if you put them on a piece of paper and you draw a line from point A to point B, you automatically get a straight point. It doesn't really matter where those points are. You'll always get a straight line, right? It's only when you add a third point that you can really make sure you are moving forward in a particular direction. And I think sometimes in innovation, we become obsessed with the present and the future, and we don't align to what has happened before. And I think that's what Steve's saying. And that needs to be a big part of our culture if we are to be innovative. We have to embrace what has come before, because when we connect that backward point to the present point and then draw a point to the future, that's when we can make sure we're moving in a straight line. Otherwise, we can very easily just be walking in circles and achieve really very, very little and not really have that value, right, that Insight defines as really being the point of innovation. So I would just, support that really culture and innovation's got to be integrated, I think. It's got to be embedded in it. And part of that has got to be a value of where you came from. And that needs to be kind of your point of reference.
Wonderful analogy. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Jacqueline, feel free to chime in. I don't know if your question was answered on the chat by Steve, but.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excuse me. Sorry about that. I think it was somewhat answered. So thank you, Steve, for answering it. But I would just say, I do user experience, design, research, and strategy. And I find that for probably most of the organizations I've ever worked for, if I were to try to use the concepts align and adapt, they would say, basically, sorry about that, that that the adaption is with my alignment to the business unit or priority or whatever. It doesn't really leave like the freedom that the word adapt, I think, is trying to convey. And if I were to say to a creative team, well, we want to adapt and align, to switch the words, they would say, okay, so we want to adapt, that's invented, but wait, how can we align? So I think that it's interesting to combine them into one principle, just because from my work experience, in order to get like the baby with the bathwater, analogy, which works quite well, to answer the question, I think I've always had to separate the two, because no kind of organization, or maybe it's just the superiors I've had, and like the concept of alignment means like coming to a common, like lowest common denominator. If you remember like your grade school, like mathematics, and adaption is either to adapt to that lowest common denominator or adapt in an innovative way. And the thought of looking at both sides of that same coin, at least in a lot of places I've worked, it's just required a separation. Like I agree with the principle. I don't think that I would be able to present it as align and adapt, because those are two, let's say, too easily conflicting for me to present it as one concept. But I hope that's clear. But I mean,
absolutely. Because so much in language, there might be too much baggage with those terms. If I could offer an alternative term from like the world of semiotics, is the concept of essence and expression, as well. That within any organization, we might develop a product or a service or something like that. That is the fundamental sort of what of the organization. That's the thing which is tangible. That's the something that you're doing that is deriving value or producing an impact. But the organization isn't defined by that product. It's defined by the essence of what that product is. And if you can go back and to understand what the essential idea is that transcends just that particular product that's meeting that particular need in that particular moment in time, if you can understand what the essence of it is and align to that essential element, then that gives you a greater range of options of what that can become, that allows you to break free from some of the path dependency that we see often takes place in industries.
So I would say I totally agree. I love the essence and expression, alternative wording. And I'm, as a psychology major, I am all for using synonyms that have, let's say, less baggage than others that might have more. But I think, I enjoyed the presentation overall. I actually came in like 2 or 3 minutes late. So you guys were doing your first poll. So I hope I didn't ask something like that was answered. I'm assuming
no worries.
I would just say another thing is organizations, at least I'll say multinationals, but many based, in New York, which is where I am. I think a hurdle for innovation in general, because innovation's been a buzzword for more than a decade. I would say the newest phrase is like data driven is more of a buzzword, and digital transformation is on its way out just because it's been around for so long. But the point is that people are too focused on the immediate outcome and not focused enough on longer term outcomes. Yeah. So the coffee, it doesn't just give someone a hot beverage that moment. It also gives them, it gives them hydration, but coffee is also dehydrating. So let's just pretend that's water for my example right now. But because it has both aspects. But the point is, I think too often, and I'm a fan, actually Simon Sinek went to my university and I've heard him speak and I have his books. One of you guys mentioned him. Yeah. And he, like I am, a Brandeis alum. But I was just going to say that I think too often people are focused on the short term and not ready to invest in the long term. And, a very, very easy example of that, which is very sad, but true nowadays with COVID, at least in America, is we have a privatized healthcare system where companies, their sole purpose, since their stock market traded, is to make money. But unfortunately, they're involved in your day-to-day healthcare. And then suddenly when something global comes up, like a global pandemic, some of them will work together, some of them won't. But even with something as unexpected and hugely impactful as that, there's still some of them, don't know how to adapt to that, don't know how to deal with the here and now. And others, like countries in larger consortiums like the European Union, have learned how to work well across borders for many years. And I feel like for me, COVID has just been like a good, unfortunate, but real case study. It bothers me when people say now we're in post-COVID. I say, no, there was pre-COVID, we're in COVID. There will be post-COVID at some future date.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jacqueline, for chiming in. I see time is up. I do have one more question to the three of you. And there's a very simple question. What is your best piece of advice for everyone on the call or tuning into the recording to get started with this? Where would you start? What would you suggest?
Yeah, I think my advice is get started. So, go to the website, go to Eat, Sleep, Innovate. We even I walked through the Beanstorm process. You can get started with one of those today. So don't think too much. Yeah.
I would say don't take yourself too seriously. You know what I mean? We say we take our mission seriously, but we don't take ourselves seriously. And be willing. I think part of that curiosity, that childlike spirit of wonder, is to recognize that as you do these things, you'll probably make mistakes and stuff like that. Don't beat yourself up over that. I mean, to have that exploration mindset, that willingness. Don't be controlled by a fear that you need to be all that. Just get out, do it. And I love that. By the way, shout out to Mike, who, again, thank you for that great story.
Sharon?
Yeah, I absolutely took the words right out of my mouth. I'd say don't underestimate curiosity. Go learn, experiment, try something, and don't be afraid of failure. Just fail quickly, right? And give it another go.
And also, I guess, check for recipes that already exist for generations,
Yes.
right?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thanks, the three of you, for being with us today and sharing all of your wisdom. I sense we could go on for hours, but let's maybe book another time, maybe in a half a year or something. We'll see where all this led to. But thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you on the line for joining as well. See you soon in one of the other upcoming Innovators live sessions. Bye for now.
Bye.